This is the highest friction point between Israel and the Biden administration that we have seen throughout the course of the war, but really in the entirety of the Biden administration. I think that the impact that it will have is still unclear, both in terms of whether or not this will be a temporary hold on weapons or whether or not the administration is going to turn around and release them. But ultimately, what we're seeing is that the domestic population and domestic voices in both countries, both the strong far right in Israel and the left in the US, are pulling these leaders apart. And that friction is really coming to the fore.
Carmiel, I know you're not a weapons expert necessarily, but to the extent that we're looking at this messaging from the administration, withholding, for instance, these 2,000-pound bombs, what would they have been needed for? I guess another way of asking that is, would Joe Biden have withheld the shipment if they were, in fact, considered critical weaponry necessary for Israel to secure itself?
What the U.S. has done in its rhetoric is it has differentiated defensive munitions from offensive ones, where it's saying that it will continue to support Israel and Iron Dome and other things that it uses to defend itself from Hamas. But in many cases, Israel is using this type of bombs and weaponry to go after Hamas's terrorist infrastructure. So they may be offensively going after that type of military equipment. And so from an Israeli perspective, there's no differentiation. From a U.S. perspective, there's a very clear differentiation in terms of how these are used. Now, of course, something like a 2,000-pound bomb has huge reverberating effects. It would be much less targeted in terms of what it takes out once dropped into a civilian center like Gaza, or in this case, Rafah, where there are more than 1 million people, of whom only about 80,000 have evacuated.
Well, it's important, Carmiel, that you kind of make this distinction between defense and offense, because we have seen this before in this conflict, especially when Iran did that unprecedented strike attempting to get into Israeli territory with a barrage of drones and missiles. The U.S. did step up for Israel's defense, helping shoot those down, but made it very clear that if Israel were to retaliate in an offensive way, the U.S. wanted nothing to do with an offensive operation. Just on the subject, though, of Iran, what does this decision from the Biden administration likely mean for Iran or its proxies like Hamas? Does this embolden them in some way?
Yeah, Israel and its supporters have been very quick to point out that not only is this emboldening Hamas in the context of negotiations, where Israel has tried to use Rafah as a leveraging tool to push Hamas closer to Israel's ceasefire position, but it also sends a message to Hezbollah and to Iran that there is a wedge between the United States and Israel. And of course, U.S. support for Israel has been critical in Israel's ability to respond to any of those actors. And so this could send a very troubling message to Iran that the U.S. is not necessarily behind Israel in these moments. Something to look for is that this week, the Biden administration was supposed to certify whether or not Israel had been in violation of international humanitarian law in its operation in Gaza as a condition put forward by the Senate to release additional arms. They missed the deadline for that certification. They've said it was not for political reasons. If for any reason the United States fails to offer that certification, we could see what is happening now become much more extreme.
Well, so let's just get to the bottom of this here, because we're hearing a lot of confusing rhetoric in Washington about the president's language, about his decision to withhold these shipments. The Speaker of the House went so far as to accuse him of having a senior moment, suggesting that he was somehow confused about the supplemental that had just passed Congress. Is this, Carmiel, a shift in policy, or is this public diplomacy from the White House?
Look, it's too early to tell, because what we're seeing right now is that the U.S. is delaying but hasn't totally stopped these shipments. And we're also seeing that they are reviewing and looking at what is going to happen in Rafah to determine whether or not they would hold back other artillery or other things like that. So it's a little bit early to say. But what you do hear and see is that there had been a sweeping bipartisan support for continued support to Israel from Congress, and the administration starting to take a step back. Whether or not it's going to just be rhetoric in this moment or will have real reverberating effects for the war are yet to be seen.
Well, when we think about the war and its future, Carmiel, as Joe and Ian were just discussing a moment ago, there were ongoing, still are, attempts to reach a ceasefire agreement, though the two sides want very different things. Hamas wants this to be permanent. Israel does not. Is that more or less likely now than it was yesterday?
I think as we see all the negotiating parties are departing in real time, we are certainly further away from a ceasefire agreement than we had been maybe even a couple of days ago. That being said, there will continue to be negotiations, and it will continue to be ultimately in the interest of both parties to pursue an end to this conflict. I think the real question is when. For Hamas, they're looking for an end to conflict now that won't require them to release the hostages and won't require them to cede power. For the Israelis, they're looking for the complete military destruction and removal from power of Hamas, and they still have not achieved it. And so whether or not they're able to come to a temporary ceasefire agreement or a permanent ceasefire agreement is going to be a question of timing.